The stranger at the table. Thanksgiving had always been the favorite holiday for the Harper family. This year was no different. Grandma had set her prized silverware, the turkey roasted to perfection, and laughter filled the air. It was a time for togetherness, food, and thankfulness. But this Thanksgiving would become the one they wished they could forget. The Harper family prided themselves on being welcoming. So when an old friend of a cousin mentioned having nowhere to go for Thanksgiving, they quickly extended an invitation. The cousin described him as Uncle Joe, a distant relative whose face they couldn't quite place. Still, the thought of someone spending the holiday alone was heartbreaking. When Joe arrived, he carried a modest demeanor, his wiry frame bundled in an old coat. He had a soft-spoken charm and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As the family welcomed him, he handed Grandma a box of chocolates and settled into the festivities with ease. The evening began smoothly. Joe regaled the table with stories of his youth, speaking of small towns and jobs he'd held long ago. Yet, as he spoke, details seemed odd. He mentioned places that had been shuttered for decades and described people who would now be impossibly old. At one point, he referred to the Harper family home as just like it used to be, though none of them could recall him ever visiting. Grandma exchanged uneasy glances with her daughter, Maggie, but dismissed it as harmless nostalgia. As the night wound down, the family gathered for their traditional Thanksgiving photo. They crowded around the fireplace, and someone pulled Joe into the shot, despite his initial hesitation. After dessert, Joe thanked the family profusely for their hospitality and excused himself, saying he had a long drive ahead. He waved from the driveway, his face briefly illuminated by the car's headlights before he disappeared into the night. Later that evening, as the family reviewed the pictures taken that day, they noticed something odd about the photo with Joe. His figure was slightly blurred, almost translucent. His eyes, which had seemed a dull gray in person, now appeared stark white in the photo, staring directly into the camera. Grandma suddenly gasped. She retrieved an old photo album from her cabinet. Flipping through its yellowed pages, she stopped at a grainy black and white image. It was from Thanksgiving in 1972, long before any of the younger family members had been born. There, standing with a younger grandma and grandpa, was a man who looked exactly like Joe. The resemblance was uncanny, down to his worn coat and hesitant smile. But the unsettling part was the date scrawled on the back. Thanksgiving Day, November 23, 1972. The family scrambled to understand what they were seeing. Maggie suggested calling the cousin who had invited Joe. When they reached her, her confusion was immediate. She had no idea who they were talking about. She'd never invited anyone named Joe, nor did she know a relative by that name. Tension rose as the family began searching online, digging into local records to find any mention of their mysterious guest. What they uncovered made their blood run cold. In November 1972, a man named Joseph Harrow, who resembled their visitor, had been arrested after Thanksgiving dinner for murdering his host family. He had died in prison years later on Thanksgiving Day. The Harpers spent the rest of the night in a tense silence. Every sound seemed louder in the stillness of the house. Every creak of the floorboards an unwelcome reminder that something was not right. The next morning, Grandma noticed the box of chocolates Joe had brought. She opened it cautiously, only to find that it was empty. Inside was a note, written in old, faded handwriting. "Thank you for the hospitality. See you next time." From that year onward, the Harper family never welcomed strangers to their Thanksgiving table again. The haunted road trip. Thanksgiving break was finally here, and for Ashley, Mike, Sarah, and Dave, it meant one thing: a road trip back to their hometown for the holiday feast. The friends were college roommates, eager to leave behind the stress of midterms and dive into the comforts of home-cooked meals and family time. But their trip would take them far from the usual comforts of Thanksgiving, plunging them into a night they would never forget. The group had mapped out a clear route that would take about 6 hours. Mike, who loved driving, volunteered to take the wheel of his aging station wagon. The first few hours passed with the group singing along to playlists, snacking on chips, and joking about how much turkey they'd eat. Somewhere around hour 4, the GPS began to glitch. Recalculating, It repeated in a robotic monotone as the car's map app rerouted them through unfamiliar backroads. "It's fine," Mike said, brushing off the group's concerns. "It's probably a shortcut." The group was skeptical but went along with it. The sun had already set, and the dense woods on either side of the road felt suffocating. The deeper they drove, the quieter it became. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed absent. After half an hour of eerie silence, they stumbled upon an abandoned town. The streetlights didn't work, and the buildings, though mostly intact, were covered in graffiti and vines. A dilapidated gas station stood at the corner, its sign swinging in the wind. "Weird place for a detour," Sarah muttered, her voice uneasy. As they drove slowly through the main street, the headlights caught fleeting movement in the shadows. Dave thought he saw a figure dart between two buildings, but when he pointed it out, no one else noticed. "Probably just a raccoon," Ashley said, though her voice lacked conviction. Halfway through the town, the car lurched violently to the right. Mike swore as he pulled over. "Flat tire," he groaned, stepping out with a flashlight. The group followed, their breaths visible in the sudden chill. The tire was shredded, as though slashed by something sharp. "I didn't hit anything," Mike insisted, shining the flashlight around. The beam revealed deep gouges in the pavement, like claw marks. The group exchanged uneasy glances but decided to stay calm. They had a spare tire and tools, so Mike and Dave began the repair while the others kept watch. That's when Sarah noticed something. Footprints in the dirt, leading from the road into a nearby alleyway. While waiting, Ashley wandered a few steps from the car. The quiet was oppressive, the kind that made your ears strain for any sound. Suddenly, she heard it, a faint whisper. It was too low to make out words, but it was unmistakable. "Ashley," Sarah called, startling her. Ashley turned, but the whispering didn't stop. It seemed to be coming from all around her. She ran back to the group, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Mike replied. Before she could answer, the whispers grew louder, now audible to everyone. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping in a cacophony of murmurs. The group hurried to finish changing the tire, but the whispering soon turned into distant laughter. A shadow darted across the alley. Then another, and another. "Let's get out of here," Dave said, his voice breaking. They piled into the car, the tension thick. Mike floored the accelerator, speeding out of the town as fast as the car would allow. But the nightmare wasn't over. As they left the town limits, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, her face obscured by long, matted hair. She wore a tattered dress and raised one hand as if waving. "Don't stop," Ashley screamed. Mike swerved around her, narrowly missing the figure. When they looked back, the road was empty. The woman was gone. The hitchhiker. As they continued, the group tried to rationalize what they'd seen. "Maybe it was just some drifter," Dave offered, though he didn't believe it himself. Then Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream. "The back seat! Look!" she shrieked. The group turned to see the woman from the road sitting silently in the back seat, her face still obscured by hair. Her hand reached out toward Sarah. Mike slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. When they turned again, the back seat was empty. The group sat frozen, their breaths ragged. They drove in silence, the car tense with fear. Finally, the GPS recalibrated, leading them back to a familiar highway. They didn't stop until they reached their hometown. At Thanksgiving dinner the next day, none of them mentioned the detour to their families. But each of them noticed something strange. Faint scratches on the car's windows, as though made by fingernails. For years, they avoided discussing the night. But whenever they drove home for Thanksgiving, they made sure to stay on the main roads. The turkey that moved. It was the first Thanksgiving that Emily and Brian hosted in their newly purchased home. The house, a charming Victorian with creaky floors and tall windows, was a dream come true for the young couple. They had worked tirelessly to make it perfect for the holiday, inviting both their families over for a grand feast. As the scent of roasted turkey filled the air, Neither Emily nor Brian could have predicted the horror their home would soon unveil. The family arrived in waves. Brian's parents brought pies, and Emily's sister brought sides. Laughter and conversation filled the dining room as everyone admired the antique touches of the old house. Still, Emily couldn't shake a strange feeling. The house, as beautiful as it was, had an unsettling aura. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and on several occasions, she thought she heard faint murmuring from the attic. She brushed it off as stress. After all, hosting Thanksgiving was no small feat. When the turkey emerged from the oven, it was a masterpiece. Golden brown, perfectly basted, and massive enough to feed the entire family. Emily and Brian beamed with pride as they set it on the dining table, surrounded by all the sides. The family gathered, eager to dig in. Brian grabbed the carving knife and poised it over the turkey's breast. But before he could make the first cut, the bird moved. It was subtle, a twitch of the wing. So subtle that Brian laughed nervously. "Guess it's still got some life in it," he joked. The family chuckled, but Emily froze. She had seen it too, and it wasn't her imagination. Brian began carving, and conversation resumed. But as he cut into the turkey, the laughter died. A low, guttural groan echoed through the room, so faint it could have been the wind, or so they thought. "What was that?" Emily's sister, Claire, asked, glancing around the room. "Probably the old pipes," Brian's dad offered, but his tone betrayed his unease. Brian continued carving, revealing juicy slices of meat. But when he pierced the turkey's leg with the fork, the groan returned, louder this time. Emily's mother gasped, clutching her napkin. "That wasn't the pipes," Claire whispered. Trying to salvage the evening, Emily urged everyone to start eating. Reluctantly, the family began filling their plates, though the mood had shifted. Emily watched Brian closely as he bit into a slice of turkey. His face contorted into an expression of disgust, and he immediately spat it out. "It tastes rotten," he said, looking pale. The others hesitated to eat after that, but Emily's father, always the practical one, decided to give it a try. He took a small bite, chewed, and froze. Slowly, he placed his fork down. "It's cold," he said. "It's ice cold." Emily stared at the turkey in disbelief. It had just come out of the oven, steaming hot. How could it be cold? As if in response, the turkey shuddered again. This time more violently. Its wing jerked upward, flopping onto the table with a wet thud. The family erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as people backed away from the table. Brian grabbed the carving knife, but the turkey twitched again, this time rolling slightly as if trying to right itself. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Brian's mother demanded, her face pale. Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what's happening." Suddenly, the groaning sound returned, but it wasn't faint anymore. It filled the room, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. The turkey's chest cavity seemed to expand and contract, as if it were breathing. In a moment of panic, Brian plunged the carving knife into the turkey's chest. The groaning ceased instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. For a brief moment, everyone thought it was over. But then the knife slid out of the turkey, as if pushed from within. A dark, viscous liquid, not gravy, oozed from the wound. The smell was unbearable, a mix of rot and decay. Emily gagged, covering her mouth. The family stared in horror as something began to emerge from the cavity. At first, it looked like a hand, thin, bony, and pale. Then came the rest of it. A creature no larger than a cat, crawling out of the turkey. Its eyes were sunken, its mouth filled with jagged teeth. It let out a screech that made everyone cover their ears. "Get out of the house!" Emily screamed. The family bolted for the door, tripping over one another in their desperation to escape. Brian, still holding the carving knife, tried to confront the creature, but it moved with unnatural speed, darting across the table and onto the floor. It scuttled toward him, its movements erratic and insect-like. Emily grabbed Brian's arm and yanked him toward the door. "Leave it. Let's go." The family spilled onto the lawn, gasping for air. Inside, the dining room lights flickered, and the groaning sound began again, louder than ever. They called the police, but by the time officers arrived, the house was silent. The dining room was in shambles. Chairs overturned, plates shattered, but there was no sign of the turkey or the creature. The police dismissed the family's story as hysteria, though one officer muttered something about the house's history. Emily and Brian couldn't bring themselves to stay in the house after that night. They moved out before Christmas, leaving behind most of their belongings. Years later, Emily discovered an old newspaper article about the property. In 1923, a butcher who lived in the house had been arrested for using human remains in his Thanksgiving turkeys. His victims were never found, but locals claimed his spirit haunted the property, especially around the holidays. Emily couldn't help but wonder if she and her family had encountered something far worse than a ghost. The phantom dinner guest. Thanksgiving at the Watsons household had always been a lively affair. The large family, with cousins, aunts, and uncles scattered across the country, made it a tradition to reunite every year. This Thanksgiving was no different. An evening filled with laughter, stories, and a table overflowing with food. But this year, something or someone unexpected joined them at the table. Claire Watson was the perfect hostess. She spent weeks planning the menu, decorating the house, and arranging the seating to ensure everyone had a good time. Her husband, Tom, was in charge of capturing memories with his trusty camera. As guests arrived, Claire made sure to greet each one warmly. By 5 p.m., the house was full, the fireplace crackling, and the smell of roasted turkey wafting through the air. Everything was perfect. At least that's how it seemed. Before dinner, Tom gathered everyone in the dining room for a group photo. It was a family tradition. He set up the tripod and adjusted the camera timer while everyone arranged themselves around the long table. "Say cheese," he called as the timer beeped and the camera clicked. Dinner began, and the atmosphere was joyous. The Watsons laughed, shared memories, and marveled at Claire's cooking. The meal stretched late into the night, with no one wanting the evening to end. It wasn't until the next morning that the first sign of something unusual appeared. Tom was reviewing the photos on his laptop, preparing to send them out to relatives who couldn't attend. As he clicked through the shots, he froze. His hand hovered over the mouse as he stared at the group photo taken before dinner. "Claire," he called out, his voice shaky. Claire came into the room, drying her hands with a towel. "What's wrong?" she asked, leaning over his shoulder. Tom pointed at the screen. There, in the corner of the photo, was a face neither of them recognized. A pale, gaunt man with sunken eyes and an old-fashioned suit sat at the far end of the table, staring directly into the camera. "Who is that?" Claire whispered. The couple combed through their memories of the night. Claire was sure she had accounted for every guest, greeting them at the door and ensuring they were seated. No one remotely resembled the man in the photo. Tom zoomed in, trying to make sense of the stranger. His face was eerily detailed, too vivid to be a trick of light or a smudge on the lens. And the more they stared, the more unsettling his expression became. He wasn't smiling like the rest of the family. He looked angry. That afternoon, Claire mentioned the photo to her sister, Beth, who had also attended the dinner. Beth dismissed it at first, laughing it off as a Photoshop error or prank. But later, Beth called back, her voice shaky. "I thought you were joking," she said. "But I think I saw him too." Claire's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "After dinner, when we were cleaning up, I felt like someone was watching me. I turned around, and I swear I saw a man standing near the window. I thought it was just my imagination, but now, I'm not so sure." Over the next few days, more family members came forward with odd stories. One cousin recalled feeling cold and uncomfortable during dinner, like a draft was coming from nowhere. Another mentioned seeing a shadow pass down the hallway, assuming it was a guest heading to the restroom, only to find no one there. Claire's niece, a little girl named Lily, provided the most chilling account. "The man in the suit talked to me," she said matter-of-factly. He asked me if I liked the turkey. When pressed for details, Lily simply shrugged. I told him it was yummy. Then he said, "Good. It's my recipe." Determined to uncover the truth, Claire and Tom began researching the house's history. They learned that it had once belonged to a man named Samuel Alden, who lived there in the late 1800s. Alden was a reclusive chef who ran a small inn from the property. The stories surrounding Alden were grim. Local legends claimed that several guests who stayed at his inn had disappeared without a trace. Some said Alden experimented with his recipes using unconventional ingredients. He died in the house under mysterious circumstances, and the property had changed hands many times since. The following Thanksgiving, Claire and Tom decided to keep the gathering smaller. They didn't discuss the previous year's events, hoping to avoid scaring their guests. But as dinner began, Claire noticed something odd. The head chair at the table, which no one had claimed, seemed to creak on its own, as if someone had just sat down. The candles flickered, though there was no draft, and an icy chill spread through the room. When the meal ended, Tom hesitated before taking the group photo. "Do we really need another picture?" he joked nervously. But Claire insisted. "We can't let a silly story ruin our tradition." The photo clicked, and the evening ended without incident. But when they reviewed the image later, their blood ran cold. The man in the suit was back, sitting at the head of the table this time. His expression was even angrier, his pale hands resting on the table as though he were presiding over the meal. The Watsons eventually sold the house and moved far away, unwilling to risk another haunted Thanksgiving. But every year they still avoid taking group photos. Claire sometimes dreams of the man in the suit, his angry face looming over her as he whispers, "It's my recipe," and they always leave an empty chair at their Thanksgiving table, just in case. The forgotten basement. The Johnson family Thanksgiving was set to be a quiet affair this year. With only 4 of them, Paul, his wife Maria, their teenage son Ethan, and Paul's brother Jack, they decided to host the holiday at the family's recently inherited farmhouse. The house, built by Paul and Jack's grandparents, had stood abandoned for over a decade after their passing. Despite its state of disrepair, it held sentimental value, and the brothers had agreed to renovate it. Thanksgiving seemed like the perfect time to gather and reconnect with their roots. But by the end of the holiday, the farmhouse would reveal secrets better left undisturbed. The morning of Thanksgiving was chilly, with frost dusting the farmhouse windows. Paul and Jack spent hours setting up the dining area while Maria prepared the food. Ethan, bored and exploring, wandered into the basement. The basement door was hard to open. Its hinges rusted and would warped from time. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and descended the creaky stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint, musty smell filled his nose. The basement was largely empty, just a few cobweb-covered boxes and broken furniture. But as he scanned the room with his flashlight, the beam caught something unusual. A small door in the far corner, half hidden behind old crates. It was no more than 3 feet tall and covered in peeling paint. Ethan called for his dad, who came down, grumbling about the cold. Paul examined the door, frowning. "I don't remember this being here," he said. Jack, who had followed them downstairs, agreed. The door was locked with a rusted padlock. "Probably just storage," Jack suggested. "Old tools or something." But Ethan was curious. He insisted they open it. Paul hesitated, but Jack, always the more impulsive sibling, fetched a crowbar from the garage. With a loud crack, the lock snapped, and the door creaked open. Behind it was a narrow, dark passage leading farther underground. The walls were rough stone, and the smell of damp earth wafted out. Ethan wanted to explore, but Maria called them upstairs to help set the table. Paul promised they'd check it out later. The door was left slightly ajar, the dark passage almost beckoning as the family returned to the warm kitchen. Dinner went smoothly at first. The family shared stories, laughed, and enjoyed the feast Maria had prepared. But halfway through the meal, Ethan brought up the basement door. "You really don't remember that being there?" he asked. Paul shook his head. "No, and I spent a lot of summers here as a kid. It's strange." Jack, pouring himself another glass of wine, shrugged. Probably nothing. Let's check it out after we eat. As they cleared the table, an unsettling noise interrupted the quiet evening. A low, rhythmic thumping echoed through the house. At first, they thought it was the wind rattling the old windows. But the sound was too deliberate, almost like footsteps. Maria clutched Paul's arm. "It's coming from the basement," she whispered. Jack, trying to act brave, grabbed a flashlight. "It's probably an animal," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. Reluctantly, the family followed him downstairs. The air seemed even colder now, their breaths visible in the beam of the flashlight. The sound grew louder as they approached the small door. The door was open wider than they had left it. The thumping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Hello," Jack called into the passage. His voice echoed, but there was no response. Ethan, emboldened by curiosity, stepped forward. "Wait," Paul hissed, but it was too late. Ethan had already entered the passage. The others reluctantly followed, the narrow tunnel forcing them to walk single file. After several feet, the passage opened into a small, circular room. In the center was a stone altar, its surface blackened as if it had been burned. Around the altar were markings carved into the walls, symbols none of them recognized. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and colder than ever. Ethan pointed at something on the ground. A pile of small bones lay scattered near the altar, their brittle shapes unmistakable. "What the hell is this?" Paul muttered, his voice trembling. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Maria screamed, and Paul fumbled to get it working again. When the light returned, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A shadowy figure stood at the far end of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. Two glowing eyes stared back at them. "Run!" Paul shouted, grabbing Maria's hand. Ethan and Jack bolted ahead, their footsteps echoing as they raced back through the passage. The thumping noise returned, louder and faster, as if the shadow was chasing them. The family burst into the basement and slammed the small door shut. Jack wedged the broken padlock into the latch, creating a makeshift barrier. The thumping stopped, but they could hear faint whispers, as though multiple voices were speaking just on the other side of the door. "Get out!" Paul barked, pushing his family upstairs. They grabbed their coats and keys, leaving everything else behind as they fled the farmhouse. The Johnsons never returned to the farmhouse. Paul and Jack put it up for sale, but no buyers showed interest after a home inspector reported structural issues in the basement. Months later, a local historian contacted Paul about the property. He revealed that the farmhouse had been built over the remains of an 18th century chapel. The chapel had been abandoned after its congregation was accused of practicing occult rituals. The basement passage, it seemed, was all that remained of the cursed site. To this day, Paul dreams of the shadowy figure. In his nightmares, it doesn't stay in the basement. It comes for him, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Blackout on Thanksgiving night. It was Thanksgiving night in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, and the Myers family was finishing their traditional feast. The turkey was gone. The pumpkin pie had been devoured, and everyone was reclining in the living room, too full to move. The soft hum of the television played in the background, displaying a football game that no one was paying much attention to. Outside, the night was unusually dark. Heavy clouds obscured the moon, and the streetlights flickered faintly. But what started as a peaceful, cozy evening quickly turned into a nightmare they would never forget. Around 8:30 p.m., the power went out. The television blinked off, plunging the house into silence. "Oh, great," muttered Tom, the father of the family. "Probably the whole block." Sure enough, when they looked out the window, they saw the entire neighborhood cloaked in darkness. The streetlights had gone out, and the only light came from the faint glow of distant stars when the clouds shifted. "Let me grab some candles," said Linda, Tom's wife, heading to the kitchen. The kids, Ellie and Jake, were initially excited. To them, the blackout was an adventure. "Let's tell ghost stories," Jake said, laughing as he shined a flashlight under his chin. But their excitement faded when Linda returned to the living room, her face pale. "What's wrong?" Tom asked. "I swear I just heard footsteps in the backyard," she whispered. Tom rolled his eyes. "It's probably just the neighbors. People are outside checking their generators." Still, he grabbed a flashlight and walked to the back door. Peering through the glass, he scanned the yard. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the swing set swaying gently in the wind. Then his flashlight caught something near the fence. A figure, tall and motionless, stood just beyond the property line. Its face was obscured, but Tom felt its eyes locked on him. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence. The figure didn't move. "What is it?" Linda asked from behind him. Tom turned to respond, but when he looked back, the figure was gone. The family tried to brush off the sighting, but the tension in the house was palpable. Linda lit candles, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and the kids huddled close on the couch. Then the noises began. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping on the windows, like branches brushing against the glass. But there was no wind. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving from one window to another, circling the house. "Is someone messing with us?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Tom grabbed a baseball bat and stormed outside, determined to catch whoever was causing the commotion. He circled the house, his flashlight darting across the yard, but saw nothing. The air was eerily still, and the tapping stopped as soon as he stepped outside. When he returned, Linda met him at the door. "It's not just us," she said. "Look." Through the living room window, they could see other houses down the street. Some families had lit candles, their faint glow visible through windows. But something was off. None of the neighbors were outside investigating the blackout or the strange noises. In fact, the street seemed empty. Too empty. "They're probably just staying inside," Tom said, though even he didn't believe it. He locked the doors and tried to reassure his family. "Let's just sit tight. The power will come back soon." Hours passed. The power didn't return, and the unease in the house deepened. Around midnight, Ellie screamed from her room. Tom and Linda rushed upstairs to find her pointing at her window, tears streaming down her face. "There's someone out there," she cried. Tom pulled back the curtains, and his blood ran cold. 3 figures now stood in the yard, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring up at the house. He slammed the curtains shut. "Everyone stay downstairs," he ordered, his voice shaking. The family gathered in the living room, huddling together as the candles burned low. The tapping resumed, louder and more frantic, as though dozens of hands were striking the windows in unison. Desperate for help, Linda grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911. To her relief, the call went through. "911, what is your emergency?" A calm voice answered. "We're being harassed," Linda said. "There are people outside our house and—" The voice on the other end cut her off. "I see them." "What?" Linda froze. "What do you mean you see them?" "They're standing right behind you," the operator said. Linda screamed and dropped the phone. Tom spun around, bat in hand, but no one was there. The line went dead. At that moment, the tapping turned into pounding. The entire house shook as if the walls were being assaulted. Windows rattled, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed on the roof. "We're leaving," Tom shouted, grabbing his keys. "Now!" The family sprinted to the car, Jake clutching a flashlight and Ellie sobbing uncontrollably. Tom fumbled with the keys but managed to start the engine. As the headlights came on, they illuminated the yard. Dozens of figures now surrounded the house. Their faces were featureless, their bodies unnaturally still. As the car lurched forward, the figures turned in unison to watch them leave. The Myers family didn't stop driving until they reached a well-lit gas station miles away. They called the police, but when officers investigated the neighborhood, they found no signs of intruders. The power had returned, and the Myers home was untouched. The family never moved back to Willow Creek. Months later, Tom learned that other neighbors had reported strange occurrences that night: phantom footsteps, disembodied whispers, and shadowy figures. Some said the blackout had awakened something old, something that thrived in darkness. But no one could explain what the Myers had seen, or why it chose their home. The cry in the woods. Thanksgiving was James Walker's favorite holiday. As a lifelong outdoorsman and hunter, he looked forward to the season when he could hunt wild turkeys in the dense woods behind his family's rural cabin. It was a tradition passed down from his father, and he took great pride in preparing a fresh turkey for the holiday feast. But this year, the woods would offer him more than he bargained for. A memory so haunting, he would never venture into the forest again. It was a crisp Thanksgiving morning when James set out, rifle slung over his shoulder and a thermos of coffee in hand. The woods stretched for miles, a labyrinth of towering trees and twisting trails. James knew these woods well, every deer path and clearing etched into his memory. He walked in silence, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots the only sound. After about an hour, he spotted his target, a large wild turkey pecking at the ground in a sunlit clearing. Carefully, James raised his rifle and took aim. But just as he pulled the trigger, a loud, piercing cry echoed through the woods. Startled, he missed his shot. The turkey darted into the underbrush, but James barely noticed. He stood frozen, listening. The cry sounded human, like a child screaming in terror. James hesitated. It was unlikely anyone else was out here. His family owned this land, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Still, the cry was unmistakable. He couldn't ignore it. "Hello?" he called, his voice carrying through the trees. There was no response, just the rustle of leaves in the wind. He debated heading back to the cabin to get help, but decided against it. If a child was lost or hurt, time was critical. Gripping his rifle, James headed in the direction of the cry. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining to block out the sunlight. The air felt colder here, and the silence was unnerving. Even the birds seemed to avoid this part of the forest. Then he heard it again. A high-pitched scream, even closer this time. It sent a chill down his spine. "Hey, I'm coming to help," he shouted, quickening his pace. But as he pushed through the dense underbrush, a strange realization struck him. The cry sounded identical to the first, as though it had been replayed. James emerged into a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. In the center was a dilapidated cabin he'd never seen before, its roof sagging and windows shattered. It looked abandoned, but the sight of it made his skin crawl. The cry came again, this time from inside the cabin. "Hello," James called, approaching cautiously. The door hung ajar, creaking as the wind moved it. He stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under his weight. Pushing the door open, he peered inside. The cabin was dark, the air stale with the smell of decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light streaming through a broken window. "Is anyone in here?" he asked, his voice echoing. James's flashlight revealed a single room, empty except for a rickety table and a toppled chair. The walls were covered in scratches, as though something with claws had tried to escape. Then, in the far corner, he saw movement, a shadow shifting against the wall. It was faint, but it didn't match the beam of his flashlight. It moved on its own, fluid and unnatural. James stepped back, his heart pounding. The shadow began to take shape, elongating into a tall, humanoid figure with spindly limbs. Its head turned slowly, though it had no face. The cry came again, impossibly loud, as if it were coming from inside his own head. Terrified, James bolted out of the cabin and into the woods. The cry followed him, echoing from every direction. It was no longer just a single voice. It sounded like dozens, all screaming in unison. Branches snagged his clothes and scratched his face as he ran. The trees seemed to close in, their trunks forming an impenetrable wall. He stumbled and fell, his rifle clattering to the ground. Scrambling to his feet, James dared to look back. The shadowy figure was there, gliding between the trees, its limbs unnaturally bending as it moved. Desperate to escape, James veered onto an overgrown trail he hadn't used in years. It led to an old hunting stand his father had built, a platform high in the trees where he could hide and wait for help. Reaching the stand, James climbed the ladder, his hands trembling. From his perch, he scanned the forest below. The figure was gone, but the cries continued, distant and disjointed. James stayed in the stand for hours, the cold seeping into his bones. The cries eventually faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of the forest. But he knew better than to let his guard down. When he finally returned to the family cabin, it was nearly dusk. His wife, Sarah, met him on the porch, worry etched across her face. "Where have you been? You're hours late," she said. "I got lost," James muttered, unable to explain what had happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him back. That night, as the family gathered around the dinner table, James noticed the woods outside the window. Though the sky was dark, he could swear he saw movement between the trees, shadows flitting just beyond the edge of the yard. James never spoke of the incident to anyone, not even his family. But he never hunted in those woods again. He refused to set foot beyond the tree line, even during the day. Years later, while clearing out his father's belongings, James found an old journal. One entry caught his eye. Strange cries in the woods again. Not an animal. Not a person. Something else. Must warn James to stay away. But his father had never warned him. And now James understood why. To this day, on cold Thanksgiving nights, the cries can still be heard echoing through the woods. Those who hear them are wise enough to stay away. James learned his lesson the hard way. Some things in the forest are meant to be left alone. The poltergeist's feast. The Cleary family had always celebrated Thanksgiving with a sense of tradition. This year, however, they decided to try something new, renting a historic home in the countryside for the holiday. The old estate, known as Willowstead Manor, was advertised as a charming 19th century farmhouse, rich in history and nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont. When the Clearys arrived, the house was exactly as the brochure had described, quaint, picturesque, and steeped in rustic charm. But as they soon discovered, Willowstead Manor came with more than just antique furniture and a warm fireplace. Thanksgiving morning was idyllic. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air as Karen Cleary prepared the meal. Her husband, Peter, was outside playing football with their two sons, Max and Logan. The boys' laughter echoed across the sprawling fields, and the crisp autumn air made everything feel magical. Inside, Karen admired the old dining room. The large oak table was set with the manor's vintage china and silverware, and the flickering light from the chandelier cast a cozy glow. She felt as though they had stepped back in time. But as she placed the last dish on the table, something strange happened. One of the plates slid several inches across the surface, stopping abruptly as if caught by an invisible hand. Karen frowned but dismissed it. Perhaps the table wasn't level, she thought. Dinner began without a hitch. The family laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the feast. But halfway through the meal, Max suddenly froze, his fork hovering midair. "What's wrong?" Peter asked. "Did you see that?" Max whispered, his eyes wide. "The gravy boat. It moved." Everyone turned to look. The porcelain gravy boat sat innocently in its place, unmoving. Peter chuckled. "You're imagining things, buddy. Probably bumped the table." But Karen wasn't so sure. She had seen something too, a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye, like a shadow darting along the far wall. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the house began to change. The once cozy dining room felt colder, the warmth from the fireplace barely cutting through the chill. The chandelier swayed slightly, though there was no draft. The boys were excused to play board games in the living room while Karen and Peter cleaned up. As they carried plates to the kitchen, Karen stopped suddenly. The antique china cabinet, which had been closed earlier, now stood wide open. "Did you open that?" she asked Peter. "No," he replied, frowning. Maybe it was the wind? But the air in the house was still, heavy with an unsettling quiet. The first unmistakable sign came while Karen was washing dishes. A wineglass on the counter shattered without warning, sending shards flying. She gasped, her hand trembling as Peter rushed to her side. "It just broke," she said, her voice shaky. "I didn't touch it." Before Peter could respond, a loud crash echoed from the living room. They sprinted to find Max and Logan huddled in the corner, their faces pale. "The board game. It flew off the table," Logan cried. Peter glanced at the table, now bare, with the game pieces scattered across the floor. "It must have fallen," he began, but Max interrupted. "No, Dad. It flew. Like someone threw it." Determined to prove there was a rational explanation, Peter returned to the dining room to investigate. Karen followed reluctantly, clutching her phone as if it could protect her. The table, once beautifully set, was now in disarray. Plates had been pushed to the floor, and the candlesticks lay on their sides. The chandelier swung gently, casting strange shadows on the walls. Peter picked up a fallen plate. "I don't know what's happening," but before he could finish, the chandelier crashed to the table with a deafening clang. The lights flickered, and a cold gust of air swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. Karen screamed, "We need to get out of here." As they gathered the boys and prepared to leave, a faint sound stopped them in their tracks. It started as a low murmur, barely audible, but it grew louder, forming distinct words. "Leave, now." The voice was deep, gravelly, and filled with malice. It seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Max began to cry, and Logan clung to his mother's arm. "Everyone outside," Peter barked, his voice cracking. They bolted for the door, but as they reached the foyer, it slammed shut on its own. Peter struggled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The murmuring grew louder, overlapping with whispers that seemed to come from every direction. Karen turned to see a dark shadow at the top of the staircase, its form twisting unnaturally as it descended. In a desperate bid to escape, Peter kicked at the door until it splintered open. The family spilled out into the cold night air, panting and trembling. They ran to their car, but as Peter fumbled with the keys, the engine wouldn't start. Karen glanced back at the house. The shadowy figure stood in the window watching them. Its shape flickered, almost as if it were laughing. Finally, the engine roared to life, and they sped away, leaving the house and their belongings behind. The Clearys never returned to Willowstead Manor. The rental company refused to refund their money, dismissing their story as hysteria. Months later, Karen did some digging and learned that the house had a dark history. In the early 1900s, the original owners, a wealthy but reclusive family, had died mysteriously during Thanksgiving dinner. Locals claimed the spirits of the family still lingered, angered by anyone who dared to disturb their feast. To this day, Karen refuses to set foot in a historic home. And every Thanksgiving, when the family gathers in their new, modern house, they leave an empty seat at the table, just in case. The uninvited. Thanksgiving in the quaint town of Stillwater was always a quiet affair, with most families choosing to celebrate at home. The Wright family was no exception. That year, Margaret and Jonathan Wright invited a small group of friends and family to join them in their warm, candlelit dining room. The evening promised good food, laughter, and holiday cheer. But someone or something arrived at the Wrights' Thanksgiving dinner uninvited, bringing with it a darkness that would linger long after the holiday was over. Dinner had just begun when Margaret noticed the figure. She was placing a basket of bread rolls on the table when she glanced out the window and froze. There, standing by the edge of the yard, was a man dressed in dark clothes. His face was obscured by shadows, but his posture was unnerving, rigid and unnatural, as though he were a statue. "John," she whispered, gripping her husband's arm. "There's someone outside." Jonathan joined her at the window, squinting into the darkness. "Probably just a neighbor out for a walk," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "I'll check after dinner." Margaret tried to shake the image from her mind, but when she looked again, the man was gone. The Wrights' dining table was a long oak piece that could comfortably seat 12. That night, 11 people were present, 6 family members and 5 close friends. but Margaret had accidentally set an extra place. The 12th chair sat at the far end of the table, empty and silent. "Who's the extra plate for?" Jonathan's sister, Helen, asked with a smile. Margaret frowned. "I don't know," she admitted. "I must have lost track while setting up." "Well, we have room for one more," Helen joked. "Maybe someone else will show up." The table laughed, but Margaret felt a chill creep down her spine. As dinner progressed, the conversation was lively. Stories were shared, jokes exchanged, and compliments were made about the perfectly roasted turkey. But midway through the meal, Jonathan noticed something strange. "Is it just me, or is it freezing in here?" he asked, rubbing his arms. Others began to agree, their breath visible in the candlelight. Margaret checked the thermostat, but it was set to 72 degrees. The heating system hummed quietly, indicating it was working. Yet the air had turned icy, and the chill seemed to emanate from the far end of the table, near the empty chair. As the evening wore on, Margaret tried to ignore the cold, focusing instead on serving dessert. She carried a pumpkin pie to the table, but as she placed it down, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The empty chair had been pulled out, as though someone had sat down. "John," she hissed, tugging at his sleeve. "Did you move that chair?" He frowned and shook his head. "It's just loose, probably slid out on its own." But Margaret wasn't convinced. The chair hadn't simply slid. It was perfectly positioned, its back straight and aligned with the table. And as she stared at it, she swore she saw a faint impression on the cushion, as though someone invisible was sitting there. As the group began to eat dessert, a faint sound disrupted the cheerful atmosphere. It was a whisper, soft, unintelligible, but unmistakable. "Did anyone hear that?" Helen asked, looking around nervously. "Hear what?" one of the guests replied. "That whispering," Helen said, her voice shaky. Everyone fell silent, straining their ears. First there was nothing. Then the whisper came again, louder this time. It seemed to echo from the walls, like multiple voices overlapping in an eerie chant. Margaret clutched her husband's arm. "I want everyone to leave," she whispered. Jonathan stood, attempting to calm the room. "It's probably just the wind outside," he said, though his face was pale. The whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Margaret began clearing the table, eager to end the night. But as she reached for the empty plate at the far end, the candles flickered violently. And then they saw it. A shadowy figure materialized in the empty chair. Its outline was faint but unmistakable, human-like, but distorted, with long, bony fingers resting on the table. Its head tilted slightly, as though observing them. Everyone froze, their breaths caught in their throats. The figure slowly raised its hand, pointing toward Margaret. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, filling the room with a cacophony of incomprehensible words. Margaret backed away, her heart pounding. Jonathan moved to shield her, but before he could act, the figure vanished. The whispers stopped, and the room returned to silence. Shaken, the guests quickly gathered their belongings and left, muttering excuses about early mornings and long drives. As Margaret cleaned up, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The plate at the empty seat was smeared with food, gravy, cranberry sauce, and a single bite of pumpkin pie. On the table, where the figure's hand had rested, was a scorch mark in the shape of a clawed handprint. That night, neither Margaret nor Jonathan could sleep. The events replayed in their minds, and every creak of the house made them jump. By morning, Jonathan called a local historian to ask about the property's history. What he learned was chilling. Decades earlier, a reclusive man named Thomas Graves had owned the land. Known for his hostility toward the community, he had died alone on Thanksgiving night after refusing to share his meal with a starving traveler. Some said his spirit lingered, cursed to watch others celebrate the holiday he had rejected. The Wrights never hosted Thanksgiving again. They moved to a new home within a year, but Margaret remained haunted by the events of that night. Every Thanksgiving, without fail, she found herself setting an extra plate, an unconscious habit she couldn't break. and no matter where they lived, she would always wake in the middle of the night to find a single chair pulled out from the dining table, waiting for an uninvited guest. The curse of the native artifact. The Reynolds family had always spent Thanksgiving enjoying outdoor activities before their meal. This year, with unusually warm November weather, they decided to take a family hike. Their destination was Echo Ridge, a local trail known for its stunning views and rich history. The trail cut through dense woods and ended at a rocky overlook where native artifacts had been discovered decades earlier. The day began as a simple family outing, but by nightfall, the Reynolds family would regret ever stepping foot on the trail. The hike was picturesque, with fallen leaves carpeting the forest floor and the occasional sound of birdsong. Amy and Eric Reynolds led their teenage daughters, Kate and Lily, along the winding path, stopping frequently to admire the scenery. About halfway up the trail, Lily noticed something shiny poking out from beneath a pile of leaves. She knelt to investigate and uncovered a small object, a stone carving, intricately etched with symbols. It was no larger than her palm, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. "Look at this!" she exclaimed, holding it up. Eric frowned. "That's probably an artifact. We should leave it here." "Come on, Dad," Lily said, rolling her eyes. "It's just a rock." Before Eric could protest, Lily slipped the stone into her pocket and jogged to catch up with her sister. Amy gave her husband a reassuring pat. "It's harmless," she said. "Let her keep it." Eric wasn't so sure. The family reached the overlook by late afternoon. The view was breathtaking. The valley below bathed in golden light. They took turns snapping photos, laughing as Kate teased Lily for taking too many selfies. But as they prepared to head back down the trail, an eerie sound stopped them in their tracks. It was a cry, high-pitched and mournful, echoing through the trees. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, as though something was moving toward them. "Is that an animal?" Kate asked, her voice trembling. Eric shook his head. "I don't think so." The family hurried down the trail, the festive mood now replaced by unease. The woods seemed darker, the air heavier. The cry continued, always distant but never fading, like it was following them. As they neared the trailhead, Lily suddenly stumbled. Eric rushed to help her up, but she cried out in pain, clutching her ankle. "It's just a twist," she said, wincing. "I can walk." Eric noticed something strange. Her pocket, where she had placed the stone, seemed to bulge unnaturally, as though the object had grown larger. But before he could say anything, the cry came again, this time impossibly close. "Let's get back to the car," Amy said, her voice taut with fear. The Reynolds family piled into their SUV, relieved to leave the woods behind. As Eric started the engine, Lily pulled the stone from her pocket. It was no longer small. It had grown to the size of a grapefruit, its surface pulsing faintly as though it were alive. "What the hell is that?" Kate exclaimed. I don't know," Lily stammered, dropping the stone onto the floor. "It wasn't like this before." Eric stopped the car and turned to face his family. "We need to get rid of it. Now." Before anyone could respond, the cry echoed again, this time from inside the car. Panicked, Eric grabbed the stone and hurled it into the woods. For a moment, the family sat in stunned silence, waiting for the nightmare to end. But it didn't. The SUV's interior lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. A shadow passed over the windshield, though the sky outside was clear. Then came the whispers, soft, guttural voices that seemed to seep from the walls of the car. "We need to go," Amy screamed. Eric hit the gas, speeding down the empty road. The whispers faded, but the oppressive feeling lingered, like an invisible presence had hitched a ride with them. By the time they reached home, the family was too shaken to eat their Thanksgiving dinner. Eric and Amy tried to reassure the girls, but both knew something was deeply wrong. That night, Lily woke screaming. Amy and Eric rushed to her room to find her thrashing in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "It's here," she cried. "The stone, it's here." Eric turned on the lights, but the room was empty. He tried to calm Lily, but she pointed to her desk. There, sitting in the center, was the stone. "I threw it away," Eric whispered, his voice breaking. "I threw it into the woods." The family spent the rest of the night in the living room, too afraid to separate. At dawn, Eric called the local historical society to ask about the artifact. The curator listened quietly before responding in a grave tone. "That area of Echo Ridge is sacred ground," she said. "The artifacts belong to the spirits of the land. Disturbing them is said to invoke their wrath." Eric explained the stone's behavior, and the curator fell silent. Finally, she said, "You must return it, tonight, and leave an offering of food. Apologize. If you don't, they won't stop." That evening, the Reynolds family returned to Echo Ridge, carrying the stone and a plate of Thanksgiving leftovers. The woods were eerily quiet, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. At the overlook, Eric placed the stone on the ground and set the plate beside it. Together, the family spoke aloud, apologizing for taking what didn't belong to them. As they turned to leave, the cry came one final time, louder and more piercing than ever. The ground trembled, and the wind roared through the trees. Then, as suddenly as it began, the forest fell silent. The family never returned to Echo Ridge. Over time, the nightmares faded, and the whispers stopped. But every Thanksgiving, they leave a plate of food in their backyard as a sign of respect. Lily still dreams of the stone sometimes. In her dreams, it grows larger and larger, its symbols glowing as shadows encircle her. And every year, as Thanksgiving approaches, she feels a chill in the air, as though something is watching, waiting.